The day an empire learned the value of a human began with the sound of people running away. Ethan Walker heard the alarms before he saw the storm. The warning sirens echoed through the upper levels of the royal capital, rising and falling beneath the distant growl of thunder. He stood at the observation platform of the Western Defense Tower and watched dark clouds roll across the horizon like an ocean swallowing the stars. Blue lightning flashed inside the storm. Not natural lightning. Plasma currents. The kind that only appeared when orbital systems were failing. Far below, thousands of lights moved through the streets. Shuttles lifted from launch platforms. Emergency transports crossed the sky. Entire sections of the city were evacuating. Ethan tightened his grip on the railing. Something felt wrong. Not the evacuation. Not the storm. The people. Fear moved differently through a crowd than through a military unit. Crowds ran from danger. Soldiers ran toward responsibility. Tonight, he was seeing too many uniforms moving in the wrong direction. A transport vessel roared overhead. Then another. Then another. Ethan watched a squad of royal guards hurry across a connecting bridge. Their pace was too fast. Their eyes avoided contact. One of them carried luggage. Luggage. During a planetary emergency. Ethan frowned. The communication panel on his wrist activated. Sergeant Walker. Immediate reassignment. The voice belonged to Central Command. Ethan straightened. Receiving. Proceed to the Royal Citadel. Priority clearance granted. The channel closed before he could ask questions. That alone was unusual. Ethan took one last look at the darkening horizon before heading toward the transport corridor. The city felt different as he moved through it. Too quiet in some places. Too loud in others. People hurried past carrying cases and personal belongings. Officials moved between government buildings with tense expressions. Every screen displayed emergency notices. Every conversation stopped when he walked by. The atmosphere reminded him of a ship taking on water while the passengers pretended everything remained under control. 20 minutes later, Ethan arrived at the Royal Citadel. The massive structure stood at the center of the capital like a mountain of silver stone and illuminated crystal. Normally the palace grounds buzzed with activity. Ceremonies. Diplomats. Guards. Staff. Tonight, entire sections looked abandoned. Ethan passed through security checkpoints that should have been crowded. Most stood empty. The deeper he entered the palace, the stranger things became. Hallways echoed with silence. Doors remained open. Offices sat unattended. He even passed two senior officials carrying personal storage cases toward a private exit. Neither acknowledged him. Neither looked back. Ethan stopped beside a window overlooking the eastern landing platforms. His stomach tightened. Dozens of executive transports were departing. Not arriving. Leaving. One after another. The communication panel activated again. Proceed to the throne chamber. Ethan followed the instructions. The journey took him through the oldest section of the palace. Ancient halls lined with statues of rulers long gone. The building seemed to hold its breath. Finally he reached the enormous doors leading into the royal chamber. Two guards stood outside. Or at least they were supposed to. The positions were empty. Ethan stared for a moment. Then he pushed the doors open himself. The chamber beyond stretched nearly 200 feet from end to end. Crystal pillars rose toward a ceiling filled with star-like lights. The throne sat at the far side of the room beneath a towering arch. It was empty. For a brief moment Ethan thought the room had been abandoned too. Then he saw her. Queen Lysara Vane stood beside a massive window overlooking the city. She was alone. Completely alone. The ruler of one of the most powerful civilizations in the sector stood without advisors, without attendants, without guards. Silver blue light from the storm illuminated her profile. Her elegant ceremonial robes moved gently in the draft coming through the chamber. She did not turn when Ethan entered. Her attention remained fixed on the city below. Thousands of evacuation lights crossed the darkness beyond the glass. One by one. Leaving. Ethan approached slowly and stopped several feet away. Protocol required him to announce himself. Before he could speak, the Queen quietly broke the silence. "Do you know what is interesting about fear, Sergeant Walker?" Her voice remained calm, almost thoughtful. Ethan hesitated. "No, Your Majesty." Another transport disappeared into the storm outside. Lysara watched it go. "Fear reveals who people really are." The chamber fell silent again. Ethan looked around the enormous room. Empty stations. Empty corridors. Empty guard positions. Then he looked back at the Queen standing alone before the approaching storm. For the first time since arriving at the palace, he understood what was happening. The crisis had not reached its worst moment yet. But many people had already made their choice. And judging by the growing emptiness inside the royal citadel, they had chosen themselves. The storm pressed harder against the palace windows as the silence between Ethan Walker and Queen Lysara stretched across the vast chamber. Outside, another transport vessel rose from the capital and vanished into the dark clouds. The Queen watched it until its lights disappeared. Then another followed. And another. Each departure seemed to remove a piece of the city with it. Ethan remained where he stood. He had spent years serving among dozens of species across the frontier systems, but he had never seen anything like this. Entire governments usually became louder during a crisis. More meetings. More orders. More people. Here, the opposite was happening. The closer danger approached, the emptier everything became. Lysara finally turned away from the window. The silver-blue fabric of her royal robes caught the light from the crystal pillars surrounding the throne chamber. For the first time, Ethan saw something beyond authority in her expression. Fatigue. Not physical fatigue. The kind that came from carrying responsibility too long. "How many guards are assigned to the inner palace tonight?" she asked. Ethan knew the answer immediately. 312, Your Majesty." A faint smile touched her lips. "And how many remain?" Ethan hesitated. He did not want to guess. Yet he already knew. The empty checkpoints. The abandoned corridors. The missing security teams. Far fewer than that. The Queen nodded. She seemed neither surprised nor angry. Somehow that made the situation worse. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. One of the communication consoles activated beside the throne. Lysara approached and accepted the transmission. A holographic image appeared above the console. 3 senior advisors stood together inside what looked like a secure transport bay. Behind them, crews loaded equipment onto evacuation vessels. Ethan noticed that none of them looked directly at the Queen. "Your Majesty," the oldest advisor began. His voice sounded careful. Too careful. "The Council has completed its assessment." Lysara folded her hands calmly. "And?" Another advisor stepped forward. "We strongly recommend immediate relocation." "To where?" Silence followed. The advisors exchanged glances. Finally, the first speaker answered. "A classified refuge beyond the outer systems." The Queen looked at them for several seconds. "Without the capital?" Nobody answered. "Without the people?" Still silence. Ethan watched the conversation unfold. Something about it felt wrong. The advisors were speaking to their ruler as if she were the problem that needed moving, not the person they were supposed to support. Lysara seemed to reach the same conclusion. "I see," she said quietly. The oldest advisor cleared his throat. "Time is limited." The Queen nodded. "Then perhaps you should not waste any more of it." Before any of them could respond, she ended the transmission. The hologram vanished. Silence returned. Ethan stared at the inactive console. That did not seem productive. To his surprise, Lysara laughed softly. The sound lasted only a second. No. It did not. Another alarm echoed somewhere deep within the palace. This one sounded different. Closer. More urgent. Ethan instinctively checked his wrist display. Several internal security zones had gone offline. Entire wings of the Citadel no longer reported active personnel. He looked toward the Queen. Your Majesty, permission to speak freely. Granted. Ethan chose his words carefully. I think people are leaving faster than the official reports indicate. The Queen walked slowly toward the throne platform. Empty seats surrounded it. Empty stations. Empty responsibilities. I know. Ethan frowned. You know? She stopped beside the throne but did not sit. I have known for hours. Another transport launched outside. The flash of its engines briefly illuminated the chamber. Lysara watched the reflection fade from the floor. Fear arrived before the storm. Ethan followed her gaze toward the city. Thousands of lights still moved below. Yet many traveled away from the palace. Away from responsibility. Away from her. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Then a new notification appeared on his wrist display. Priority evacuation order. Personnel category: Human Auxiliary Forces. Immediate departure recommended. Ethan read the message twice. Every human assigned to palace service had just been authorized to leave. No approval required. No delay. He slowly lowered his arm. The Queen noticed. Bad news? Ethan considered the question. Beyond the windows, the storm continued swallowing the horizon. Inside the palace, another section of lights suddenly went dark. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. Then another. The citadel felt like a ship being abandoned while still afloat. Not for me, Ethan said quietly. For whoever expects this place to keep functioning. For the first time, Lysara looked directly at him. Not as a ruler. Not as a superior officer. Just as one person looking at another. Outside, another evacuation vessel disappeared into the storm. Inside the throne chamber, 2 people remained. And neither of them had left. The evacuation order remained on Ethan Walker's wrist display long after the notification sound faded. Immediate departure recommended. Human Auxiliary Forces. He stared at the words while distant thunder rolled through the palace walls. Outside the towering windows, the storm continued swallowing the night sky one sector at a time. Blue plasma currents flashed across the clouds like cracks spreading through glass. The capital below seemed smaller now. Not because the city had changed. Because so many of its lights were leaving. Another transport vessel lifted from a government platform and disappeared into the darkness. Then another. Then another. Ethan lowered his arm and looked across the throne chamber. Queen Lysara remained standing beside the elevated platform, surrounded by a silence that felt larger than the room itself. Every empty guard station seemed to emphasize the same truth. People were leaving. Important people. Powerful people. People who had once sworn loyalty. Yet somehow the palace felt calmer than before. As if all the pretending had finally stopped. A soft tone echoed from Ethan's communicator. Another message. This one carried military authorization codes. He opened it. The contents were brief. Final transport departing in 23 minutes. Personnel not aboard will be considered voluntarily remaining within the emergency zone. No additional extraction guaranteed. Ethan read the notice twice. Then he closed it. The decision sounded simple when written on a screen. Leave or stay. Safety or uncertainty. Logic or loyalty. Across the chamber, Lysara noticed the movement. Another evacuation order? She asked. Ethan nodded. The last one. The Queen looked toward the storm beyond the glass. You should take it. Ethan blinked. The answer arrived too quickly. Too calmly. Your Majesty? She folded her hands behind her back. You are not one of my citizens. You are not bound by our traditions. Her voice remained steady. You have no obligation to remain here. Ethan listened quietly. The strange thing was that she genuinely meant it. There was no manipulation. No request hidden beneath the words. If anything, she sounded concerned. Concerned for him. The realization caught him off guard. Another section of palace lighting dimmed somewhere beyond the chamber. Emergency systems immediately activated in response. Soft red illumination replaced the usual silver glow. The room suddenly looked older, colder, more honest. Ethan walked toward one of the massive windows overlooking the city. Hundreds of transport lights moved across the darkness below. They reminded him of fireflies drifting away from a field before winter arrived. "When I enlisted," he said quietly, "my first commander told me something." Lysara remained silent, listening. "He said duty is easy when people are watching." Ethan looked at the city below. "The difficult part is deciding who you are when nobody is." The Queen studied him for several seconds. Then she looked away, as if the answer carried more weight than she expected. Another communication alert appeared. This time it came from Palace Security. Ethan opened the report automatically. The numbers made his stomach tighten. Active Royal Guard personnel remaining inside the Citadel, 12. He checked it again. 12. Hours earlier there had been more than 300. He almost thought the report contained an error. Then he remembered the empty checkpoints, the abandoned hallways, the officers carrying luggage. No. The report was probably accurate. The palace was becoming a shell. Ethan approached the central command console and activated an internal map. Security markers appeared throughout the structure. Most were dark. A handful remained active. Then several disappeared while he watched. 9. 7. 5. The Queen glanced toward the display. Neither commented. Neither needed to. The numbers explained everything. Somewhere far below, the final stages of evacuation continued. Somewhere beyond the storm, people were already planning new lives in safer places. Somewhere in the palace, more doors were quietly closing. Then a transport controller contacted Ethan directly. The holographic image of a human flight officer appeared above the console. "Sergeant Walker." The officer looked relieved. "There you are." Ethan straightened automatically. "Report. Final shuttle departs in 19 minutes. The officer hesitated. "You need to get moving." Ethan remained silent. The flight officer lowered his voice. "Listen. Nobody will question your decision. Everyone is leaving." Ethan glanced toward the Queen. She stood alone beside the throne platform. Alone in a palace built for thousands. Alone in a government built around her authority. Alone in a city that still called her ruler. The flight officer continued speaking. "Walker?" Ethan finally answered. "Thank you." "For what?" Ethan looked at the evacuation notice one last time. Then he reached forward and declined the transport authorization. The confirmation icon vanished from the screen. "For making the choice simple." The officer stared at him. "You cannot be serious." Ethan ended the transmission. Silence returned immediately. The storm growled beyond the palace walls. The city lights continued drifting away. Behind him, Queen Lysara remained perfectly still. Finally she spoke. "You understand what you just did?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." The last evacuation route was gone now. No backup plans. No guaranteed escape. No promise of rescue. Only the palace. The storm. And the woman everyone else seemed willing to abandon. Ethan looked toward the dark windows where another transport disappeared into the night. Then he turned away from it. Because for the first time that evening, he knew exactly where he belonged. The palace felt different after the last evacuation shuttle departed. Not quieter. Emptier. As if the building itself had noticed how many promises had just left through its gates. Ethan Walker stood near the central security console watching status indicators fade one by one across the enormous map of the Royal Citadel. Entire sections no longer reported activity. Residential wings. Administrative halls. Council chambers. Places that once held thousands of conversations now sat dark beneath the storm. Queen Lysara studied the display beside him. Neither seemed surprised anymore. The surprises had already happened. The departures. The abandoned posts. The realization that loyalty could disappear faster than fear. Another distant roll of thunder vibrated through the palace walls. Then the lights flickered. For a moment the throne chamber dimmed. Emergency systems activated immediately, bathing the room in soft amber illumination. The ancient crystal pillars glowed faintly. Shadows stretched across the polished floor. The room suddenly looked older than before. Older and somehow more honest. A notification appeared on the security console. Internal transit network unstable. Restricted access recommended. Ethan reviewed the report. Several primary corridors connecting the upper palace to underground facilities were becoming unreliable. If conditions worsened, movement through the citadel would become difficult. He glanced toward Lysara. Your Majesty, there is something we should probably do. She looked at him. Leave? Not exactly. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Ethan pointed toward the lower sections of the palace map. The oldest infrastructure is underground. Thicker walls. Independent power systems. Better protection from the storm. Lysara studied the highlighted pathways. Recognition appeared in her eyes. The Founder corridors. Ethan nodded. You know them? She looked toward the distant ceiling. I have not visited them since childhood. The answer surprised him. The palace contained entire sections even its ruler rarely entered. Somehow that felt appropriate. Great civilizations often buried their beginnings beneath newer layers. Another warning signal flashed. Ethan made his decision. We should move now. For several seconds Lysara remained still. Looking not at the map. Not at the storm. At the throne. The seat of imperial authority stood alone beneath the crystal arch, empty. Silent. Abandoned by almost everyone who once surrounded it. Ethan wondered what she was thinking. Then she turned away from it. Lead the way, Sergeant. Together they left the throne chamber. The enormous doors closed behind them with a low mechanical hum. The sound echoed through the deserted hallway beyond. Ethan activated a portable light and guided their route through the inner palace. The corridors seemed endless. Decorative murals lined the walls. Ancient rulers. Historic ceremonies. Diplomatic triumphs. Images celebrating centuries of stability. Yet tonight no servants crossed their path. No guards patrolled intersections. No advisors hurried between meetings. The palace had become a museum of itself. Their footsteps echoed softly through the silence. After several minutes they reached a massive circular doorway hidden behind a gallery of historical statues. Dust covered portions of the entrance. Few people came here anymore. Ethan accessed the control panel. Ancient mechanisms awakened. Stone-like doors separated slowly with a deep rumble. Cool air drifted outward from the darkness beyond. The passage revealed itself. Long, narrow. Ancient. Blue guide lights illuminated the floor at regular intervals. Lysara stared into the corridor. My grandfather used to bring me here. Ethan glanced toward her. For lessons? She nodded. History. Responsibility. Tradition. Her expression softened briefly. I hated it. Ethan laughed quietly. The sound surprised both of them. For the first time that night, something felt normal. Human. The Queen smiled as well. Only for a second. Then they continued forward. The Founder corridors stretched deep beneath the palace. Historical displays appeared along the walls as they descended. Early settlements. Construction projects. Images of the civilization's first years. Ethan slowed occasionally to examine them. Something caught his attention. The oldest recordings looked different from modern society. Less formal. More collaborative. Leaders stood beside workers. Scientists beside explorers. People seemed connected in ways he had not expected. Lysara noticed him studying one particular display. What do you see? Ethan considered the question. Nobody looks important. The Queen examined the image. Then she nodded. Exactly. They continued deeper underground. The storm became distant. The palace above faded into memory. Here, surrounded by forgotten history, The crisis almost seemed far away. Yet Ethan knew better. The danger was still coming. The uncertainty remained. The empire above still trembled. But something had changed during their journey. Hours earlier he had been guarding a ruler. Now he was walking beside a person. A tired woman carrying the weight of an entire civilization, while everyone around her searched for escape. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast underground chamber illuminated by ancient crystal light. Historical archives surrounded the room in every direction. Thousands of years of memory preserved beneath the palace. Lysara stopped at the threshold and stared at the forgotten hall. Ethan watched the light reflect across her face. For the first time since arriving at the citadel, she did not look like a queen. She looked like someone returning home. The underground archive chamber remained silent long after Ethan Walker and Queen Lysara entered. The storm still existed somewhere above them, but down here it felt distant. Muted. The thick stone walls and ancient engineering absorbed every trace of chaos from the surface. Soft blue light flowed through crystal veins embedded in the ceiling. Rows of historical records stretched into the darkness beyond sight. Thousands of years preserved beneath the palace. Ethan slowly turned in place. I think this room is larger than the entire military academy where I trained. Lysara smiled faintly. It probably is. The chamber seemed alive in its own quiet way. Not through movement. Through memory. Every wall carried fragments of the civilization's past. Ancient holographic displays activated automatically as they approached. Images appeared and faded. Founders standing beside unfinished structures. Explorers examining new worlds. Scientists presenting discoveries. Ordinary citizens celebrating milestones long forgotten by history. Ethan noticed something strange. None of the recordings focused on power. No giant statues. No displays of conquest. No endless ceremonies praising rulers. Instead, most of the archives celebrated cooperation. Construction projects. Agricultural breakthroughs. Medical discoveries. Communities working together. The details surprised him. Lysara noticed where his attention lingered. You expected something different. Ethan nodded. Most governments build monuments to themselves. The Queen studied one of the recordings. A group of workers stood beside an early energy reactor while children watched from a safe distance. Everyone looked proud. The founders believed civilizations survive because of ordinary people. Her voice softened slightly. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. Ethan looked toward her. There was no bitterness in her tone. Only disappointment. The kind that comes when something valuable slowly disappears. They continued deeper into the archive. At the center of the chamber stood a circular platform surrounded by crystal pillars. Ancient benches curved around the space. It felt less like a government facility, and more like a place designed for reflection. Ethan set down his equipment pack near one of the benches. For the first time since arriving at the palace, either had an immediate task demanding attention. The realization felt strange. Almost uncomfortable. Lysara sat across from him. The queen of an interstellar civilization seated inside a forgotten archive while a storm threatened the capital above. Somehow the image felt more honest than the throne room. For several minutes either spoke. The silence was not awkward. Just quiet. The kind that rarely exists around powerful people. Eventually Lysara looked toward him. May I ask you something? Ethan nodded. Of course. Her gaze remained steady. Why did you stay? The question settled between them. Not because it was difficult. Because it was sincere. She genuinely wanted to understand. Ethan leaned back slightly and considered his answer. The crystal lights reflected softly across the chamber floor. I am not sure there is a dramatic explanation. A small smile touched her face. Try anyway. Ethan laughed quietly. Then he looked toward one of the archive displays. A recording showed early settlers assembling shelter structures beneath an unfamiliar sky. Nobody looked extraordinary. Yet they had built an entire future. My father worked construction back on Earth, Ethan said. Nothing glamorous. Long hours. Hard work. Lysara listened carefully. Whenever something broke, people called him. Ethan smiled at the memory. Power outages. Flood damage. Storm repairs. It did not matter. He looked down briefly. One day I asked why he never turned anyone away. The Queen remained silent. Ethan could almost hear his father's voice. He told me something I never forgot. Another pause. Then he spoke the words exactly as he remembered them. If people are counting on you, leaving is not always the right answer. The archive chamber seemed quieter afterward. Lysara lowered her eyes for a moment, as if considering the idea from every angle. That sounds very human. Ethan shrugged. Probably. Another faint smile appeared on her face. Then it vanished. The expression that replaced it looked older, more vulnerable. She stared toward the distant archives lining the walls. Do you know what I feared most tonight? Ethan expected her to mention the storm. Political collapse. The capital. Instead, she shook her head before he could answer. Not failure. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Not losing power. She folded her hands together. I feared discovering that nobody truly meant their promises. Ethan said nothing. Some confessions deserved space. Lysara continued staring into the blue light. When you spend your entire life surrounded by advisors, guards, and officials, it becomes difficult to know who believes in you and who believes in your position. The words carried no anger, only sadness. Ethan looked around the archive chamber. Thousands of years of history surrounded them. Entire civilizations preserved in crystal and light. Yet at that moment the room felt very small. Just two people having an honest conversation. For what it is worth, Ethan said quietly, I think positions are easy to follow. Lysara looked up. And people? Ethan met her gaze. People are harder. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Warmer. Somewhere above them, the storm continued moving across the capital. Somewhere above them, officials still searched for safety. But deep beneath the palace, among the forgotten memories of history, the queen who had been abandoned by almost everyone finally heard the answer she had been searching for all night. Hours passed beneath the palace. The storm above continued its march across the capital, but deep inside the Founder archives, time seemed to move differently. Ethan Walker sat near one of the ancient crystal pillars reviewing security updates from the remaining palace systems. The reports grew shorter with each transmission. Fewer personnel. Fewer active departments. Fewer functioning command centers. Entire sections of government had simply stopped responding. The empire was not collapsing in a dramatic flash. It was quietly stepping away from its responsibilities one office at a time. Across the chamber, Queen Lysara stood before a wall of historical records. Soft blue light reflected across her silver-blue robes as she examined images from centuries past. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now. Familiar. Then a sharp tone echoed through the archive. Ethan immediately looked down at his wrist display. The alert carried priority classification. Palace Defense Network offline. He read it twice. Then once more. Every major defensive system protecting the capital had just disconnected. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Deactivated. Someone had issued the command intentionally. Ethan slowly exhaled. That is not good. Lysara turned toward him. What happened? He handed her the display. She read the message. Her expression did not change. Somehow that worried him more than panic would have. The defense grid is gone, he said quietly. All of it. The Queen stared at the report for several seconds before returning it. Then it is finished. Ethan frowned. Finished? Lysara walked toward one of the archive benches and sat down. Not like a ruler receiving news. Like someone finally accepting something they already suspected. The last illusion is gone. Ethan remained standing. Your Majesty, I think most governments would consider losing planetary defenses a serious problem. A faint smile appeared. Most governments would still have a government. The answer carried no bitterness. Only truth. Ethan looked back toward the security reports. Additional notifications continued arriving. Emergency councils dissolved. Administrative offices evacuated. Regional authorities relocating beyond the system. Every update pointed toward the same conclusion. The people entrusted with maintaining order had chosen distance instead. The archive chamber seemed to absorb the news without judgment. Ancient crystal lights continued glowing softly. Historical recordings continued cycling across the walls. The founders looked down from centuries-old images while the modern empire quietly abandoned itself. Ethan found the contrast impossible to ignore. He walked toward one of the displays. A holographic scene appeared automatically. Early leaders stood alongside engineers, teachers, doctors, and workers. Nobody occupied a throne. Nobody stood above everyone else. The image felt strangely powerful. Lysara noticed what he was studying. My grandmother used to bring me here. Ethan glanced toward her. You mentioned your grandfather before. She nodded. Both of them loved this place. Her eyes drifted across the archive walls. They worried we were forgetting why the Empire existed. Ethan listened carefully. Something important hid beneath her words. And were they right? For a moment she said nothing. Then she looked around the chamber. At the founders. At the records. At the preserved memories of people who built something extraordinary. I think we stopped valuing character. The answer lingered in the air. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. Entire civilizations often measured success through power, wealth, influence, control. Yet those things rarely appeared inside the archives. The founders seemed obsessed with something else entirely. Responsibility. Service. Trust. Another communication alert interrupted his thoughts. Ethan activated it. A single surviving palace officer appeared on the display. The woman looked exhausted. Her uniform was wrinkled. The background behind her sat almost completely dark. Sergeant Walker. Ethan straightened. Report. She hesitated. There are 4 of us left. The number landed heavily. 4. A palace that once employed thousands now contained 4 active personnel. Ethan glanced toward Lysara. She remained silent. Listening. The officer continued. Everyone else is gone. No anger. No accusation. Just fact. Ethan thanked her and closed the channel. The archive chamber returned to silence. 4 people. An empire reduced to 4 loyal staff members and a human soldier who technically did not belong there at all. For the first time that night, Lysara laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the reality had become almost unbelievable. Do you know what is strange? She asked. Ethan shook his head. She looked directly at him. I feel calmer now than I did 6 hours ago. Ethan considered that. Then nodded. Because now you know. The Queen smiled softly. Yes. Now she knew. Who stayed? Who left? Who valued promises? Who valued convenience? The uncertainty was gone. Painful truths often carried that strange gift. Ethan looked around the Founder archives once more. Thousands of years of history surrounded them. Every generation eventually faced a moment when mask disappeared and character revealed itself. Maybe this was simply the Empire's turn. Above them, the storm continued crossing the night sky. Below, in the forgotten heart of the palace, a queen abandoned by almost everyone sat beside the one person who had chosen to remain. And for the first time since the crisis began, she no longer looked alone. The night grew deeper above the capital, though Ethan Walker could no longer see the sky from the Founder archives. Down here, time had become measured by quiet conversations, fading status reports, and the soft glow of ancient crystal light. The storm still existed. The crisis still existed. Yet inside the forgotten heart of the palace, something else had begun to emerge. Clarity. Ethan stood near the entrance to the archive chamber reviewing the latest updates from the remaining communication network. There were almost none. The silence spreading through official channels felt more complete with every passing hour. Entire departments had stopped transmitting. Regional governors no longer checked in. Emergency councils had dissolved into scattered fragments. The empire had not shattered. It had simply walked away from itself. Across the chamber, Queen Lysara rested on one of the archive benches. Not sleeping. Thinking. The blue light illuminated her features softly. For the first time since Ethan had met her, she looked less like a ruler and more like someone carrying the weight of a long journey. Another low chime echoed from his communicator. Ethan opened the transmission. The same palace officer appeared. The exhaustion on her face seemed even more pronounced now. "Status report," Ethan said. The officer hesitated. Then she offered a small, almost embarrassed smile. 3. Ethan frowned. 3? There were 4. Her expression turned thoughtful. 1 finally left. The answer lingered in the air. 3 personnel remained inside the largest palace on the planet. 3. Ethan thanked her and ended the call. He looked around the archive chamber. Somehow the number did not surprise him anymore. The process had been gradual. Predictable. Fear rarely announced itself dramatically. Most of the time it arrived quietly and convinced people to choose comfort over conviction. Lysara noticed his expression. "Another update?" Ethan nodded. "There are 3 palace staff members left." The queen absorbed the information without visible reaction. Then she smiled faintly. 3 more than I expected." Ethan could not tell whether she was joking. Perhaps neither could she. Several moments passed. Then Lysara rose from the bench and slowly crossed the chamber. She stopped before one of the oldest archive displays. The recording showed a founder standing before a crowd. No crown. No ceremonial robes. Just a simple uniform and tired eyes. Ethan joined her. The recording carried no audio, yet the image somehow communicated everything. Responsibility. Sacrifice. Service. The founder looked like someone who understood that leadership was rarely comfortable. Lysara studied the figure carefully. "Do you know why the founders built these archives?" Ethan shook his head. "To preserve history?" "Partly." She looked toward him. "But mostly to preserve perspective." Ethan considered that answer. It sounded important. The queen continued. "They worried future generations would become obsessed with power." Her gaze returned to the recording. "They believed memory could protect people from arrogance." Silence followed. Ethan found himself looking around the chamber again. The founders had preserved ordinary moments. Construction workers. Teachers. Explorers. Scientists. Families. Not because they were famous. Because they mattered. The realization settled deeply. Then something unexpected happened. A hidden section of the archive activated. Crystal lights brightened across the far wall. Ancient mechanisms awakened with a low hum. Ethan immediately stepped forward. Instinct. Training. Habit. Lysara remained still. The wall slowly opened, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. Neither had noticed it before. Inside stood a single pedestal illuminated by silver light. Resting upon it was an ancient recording device. Ethan exchanged a glance with the queen. Together they approached. The device activated automatically as they entered. A holographic figure appeared above the pedestal. Another founder. Older than the others. Wiser somehow. The recording began immediately. "If you are seeing this, then your civilization has reached a moment of testing." Ethan and Lysara stood silently. The founder continued. "Every generation believes its greatest threat comes from outside." The figure paused. "Most are wrong." The archive lights reflected across the chamber walls. "The true test arrives when people must choose between responsibility and self-preservation." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The founder's gaze seemed to reach across centuries. "When that moment comes, pay attention to who remains." Silence followed. Then the recording ended. Just like that. No dramatic conclusion. No instructions. No prophecy. Only a simple observation preserved for generations. Pay attention to who remains. The words echoed through the archive chamber long after the hologram disappeared. Ethan slowly looked toward Lysara. She had not moved. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty space where the founder had stood. Finally she spoke. All night I have been looking at the people who left. Ethan waited. She turned toward him. A different expression now rested on her face. Calmer. Stronger. Perhaps I should have been looking at the people who stayed. The archive chamber fell silent once more. Yet this time the silence felt different. Above them, an empire struggled with fear. Below, among the memories of those who built it, a queen finally began to understand what loyalty truly looked like. And standing beside her was the human soldier who had unknowingly become the answer to a question she had spent her entire life asking. The founder's words lingered in the archive chamber long after the recording disappeared. Pay attention to who remains. Ethan Walker found himself repeating the sentence silently while the crystal lights shimmered across the ancient walls. It sounded simple. Almost obvious. Yet the longer he thought about it, the more powerful it became. Entire governments had spent the night revealing exactly who they were. Not through speeches. Through choices. Across from him, Queen Lysara stood quietly before the pedestal where the hidden recording had appeared. Her expression had changed again. Not because the situation had improved. The storm still raged above. The palace still stood nearly empty. The empire still drifted through uncertainty. Yet something inside her seemed calmer. As if a question she had carried for years had finally received an answer. The archive chamber remained silent until another system activated unexpectedly. A low hum echoed through the walls. Crystal columns brightened. New symbols appeared across the floor. Ethan immediately checked the surrounding displays. The archive was opening deeper sections of itself. Historical files. Restricted records. Founder protocols. Layers of information untouched for generations. Lysara approached one of the displays. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the identifiers. These records should not exist. Ethan joined her. That sounds important. It is. She touched one of the floating symbols. A holographic map appeared. Not of the capital. Not of the planet. The entire Imperial network spread across the chamber in three-dimensional light. Hundreds of systems. Thousands of settlements. Trade routes. Diplomatic zones. Historical markers. Then certain locations illuminated. Founder stations. Ethan frowned. What are those? For several moments Lysara did not answer. She studied the map carefully. Then she exhaled slowly. The oldest guardians of the Accord. Ethan looked toward her. The Accord? The Queen nodded. The original agreement that united the worlds. Her voice carried a weight he had not heard before. Most people believe it became symbolic centuries ago. The map continued glowing between them. Ethan noticed that dozens of founder stations remained active. Hidden. Silent. Watching. And? Lysara met his gaze. And they were never symbolic. The realization settled heavily in the room. Suddenly many things made more sense. The archives. The hidden recordings. The emphasis on character rather than authority. The founders had built safeguards into the civilization itself. Not military safeguards. Moral ones. Another sequence activated automatically. This time a founder appeared unlike any Ethan had seen before. Not a ruler. Not a commander. A woman wearing simple expedition clothing. She stood before an unfinished settlement beneath an unfamiliar sky. The recording began. The greatest threat to any civilization is not invasion. Ethan almost smiled. The founders seemed remarkably consistent. The woman continued. It is forgetting why it was built. New images appeared around her. Families arriving on new worlds. Volunteers helping strangers. Scientists sharing discoveries freely. Communities solving problems together. Power survives only when supported by trust. The founder looked directly toward the viewer. And trust survives only when someone chooses duty over comfort. The recording faded. Silence returned. Ethan stared at the empty space where the hologram had been. Duty over comfort. The phrase felt familiar. Almost personal. Lysara turned away from the display. For the first time since he met her, she looked uncertain. Not frightened. Vulnerable. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" She hesitated. Then she laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the truth sounded absurd. "I should tell you something." Ethan waited. The Queen looked toward the archive map still hovering in the air. The storm was never the true crisis. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Lysara folded her hands together. The gesture seemed more personal than royal. The evacuation orders. The disappearing advisors. The abandoned posts. Her eyes drifted toward the ancient founder records. The founders anticipated all of it. Ethan felt a strange sensation in his chest. As if pieces were beginning to connect. "You knew?" She shook her head. "Not completely." A pause followed. "But I knew there was a possibility." Ethan remained silent. The Queen continued. "Every few generations, the founder protocol activates." Her voice lowered. "A test." The word echoed through the chamber. Ethan stared at her. "A test?" Lysara nodded. "Not of military strength. Not of political influence." She looked directly at him. "Of character." The archive lights seemed brighter now. Every recording surrounding them suddenly felt connected. The founders had spent centuries asking the same question. Who stays when leaving becomes easier? Ethan slowly sat down on one of the stone benches. The answer explained everything. The hidden archives. The preserved messages. The emphasis on loyalty. The storm had simply revealed what already existed beneath the surface. Lysara approached him. Her expression carried both sadness and gratitude. "There is one final part one have not told you." Ethan looked up. The Queen smiled faintly. "I could have left hours ago." Silence. Complete silence. The words settled across the chamber like falling snow. Ethan blinked once. Then again. Every evacuation route. Every transport. Every opportunity. She had possessed them all. Yet she remained. Not because she was trapped. Because she chose to stay. The realization changed everything. Above them, the storm continued crossing the night sky. Below, among the founders and forgotten memories, two people sat surrounded by the truth. And for the first time since the crisis began, Ethan understood that this night had never been about survival. It had always been about revealing who people truly were. The archive chamber remained silent after Queen Lysara revealed the truth. She could have left at any moment. The transports had been available. The escape routes had remained open. The storm had never trapped her. She had stayed by choice. Ethan Walker sat quietly beneath the glow of ancient crystal light and let the realization settle. Around them, thousands of years of history watched from the walls. Founder recordings shimmered softly across the chamber. Generations of people preserved in memory. Builders. Teachers. Explorers. Leaders. Ordinary citizens. All of them connected by a single question. Who remains when remaining becomes difficult? For a long moment neither spoke. Then a new tone echoed through the archive. Different from the others. Clear. Precise. Authoritative. The central archive activated. Crystal pillars brightened throughout the hall. Ancient systems awakened one final time. Ethan stood immediately. Lysara looked toward the center of the chamber. A large holographic display emerged above the archive platform. Words appeared across the light. Founder protocol complete. Evaluation concluded. Ethan stared at the message. The chamber seemed almost alive now. More systems activated. Hidden records emerged. Sealed sections unlocked. Historical pathways illuminated. Then a final recording appeared. Unlike the others, this founder wore ceremonial attire. Not elaborate. Dignified. The figure stood calmly before the viewer. If this message has been reached, then the test has ended. The founder smiled faintly. And the answer has been found. Ethan and Lysara listened in complete silence. Civilizations do not survive because of power. Power rises and falls. Images appeared behind the founder. Great cities. Governments. Fleets. Entire eras passing through history. Civilizations survive because someone chooses responsibility when nobody requires it. The founder's gaze seemed to focus directly on them. Titles do not reveal character. Comfort does not reveal character. Crisis reveals character. The recording paused briefly. Remember those who remained. Then the hologram faded. The chamber fell silent once more. Yet something had changed. The founder protocol had completed. Whatever purpose the archive served had now been fulfilled. Ethan looked toward Lysara. The queen stood motionless. Her eyes reflected the fading light. That was it? He asked quietly. A smile appeared on her face. Genuine this time. Warm. That was everything. Hours passed. The storm above slowly weakened. Communication systems began recovering. One by one, networks returned online. Regional governments re-established contact. Civil authorities resumed operations. The crisis that had triggered the evacuation began fading into history. Yet something else spread across the empire. News. Reports. Questions. Conversations. The story moved quickly. Not the storm. Not the infrastructure failures. The people. Citizens learned who had stayed. Which officials remained. Which advisors disappeared. Which promises survived. The empire began examining itself. Several days later, Ethan stood once again inside the throne chamber. The palace looked different. Lights filled the corridors. Personnel had returned. Advisors occupied their offices. Guards resumed their posts. Activity flowed through the capital as though life had resumed normally. Yet Ethan noticed something important. Nothing felt quite the same. People spoke more carefully. More honestly. The storm had revealed too much to ignore. At the far end of the chamber, Queen Lysara sat upon the throne. Not because she needed authority. Because today she had something to say. Representatives from every sector filled the room. Officials. Military leaders. Diplomats. Citizens. The chamber that once stood empty was now overflowing. Lysara rose slowly. Silence immediately followed. She looked across the gathered crowd. Then she spoke. Several nights ago, this empire faced uncertainty. The room remained still. Many people acted bravely. She nodded respectfully towards several groups. Many people worked tirelessly to protect others. Another pause. Then her gaze shifted. Toward Ethan. And one person reminded me why our civilization exists. Every eye in the chamber followed her attention. Ethan suddenly felt uncomfortable. He preferred repairs. Logistics. Quiet assignments. Not public recognition. Unfortunately, nobody seemed interested in his preference. Lysara continued. When positions failed, he remained. When certainty disappeared, he remained. When leaving became easier, he remained. The silence deepened. Ethan stood motionless. The queen smiled softly. He did not stay because he was required to. He stayed because it was right. No applause followed immediately. Something better happened. Understanding. The room seemed to absorb the meaning before responding. Then people rose to their feet. Not because a ruler commanded it. Because they wanted to. Ethan looked around the chamber. Thousands of faces. Different worlds. Different species. Different backgrounds. Yet all of them understood the same lesson. Character mattered. Loyalty mattered. Responsibility mattered. Later that evening, after the ceremony ended, Ethan stood alone on a palace balcony overlooking the city. The storm was gone. The sky above the capital shone with stars. Far below, lights stretched toward the horizon. Life continued. Footsteps approached quietly. Lysara joined him beside the railing. Neither spoke for a while. They simply watched the city breathe beneath the night sky. Finally the queen smiled. "You know, the founders would have liked you." Ethan laughed softly. "I doubt that." Lysara looked toward the stars. "I do not." Silence returned. Comfortable silence. Meaningful silence. Beneath them stood an empire that had remembered something important. Above them stretched a sky full of distant worlds. And somewhere between those two things existed a simple truth that history would not forget. Empires remembered power. But people remembered the one who stayed.